I'm the only one. Like, let me go ahead and sign out the contract. I was thinking, what are they going to do with me? They're going to put me off by myself.
Uh,
That's terrible.
it's good to have you. I'm Clark.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Desiree.
Desiree.
Yes.
Great, great. You live in town, or?
I actually do. I just moved to the area.
Oh, great, great, great. Well, sure, it's good to have you.
Yeah, it's nice here. I like it a lot.
Yeah, it's a pretty place. Yeah. How's Andrea doing?
Um, it kind of depends on
From day to day,
but
or?
she's been just more or less sleeping a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
but her counselor left Region 10, and she hasn't chose another one yet.
Oh,
So
so she's in between.
yeah,
Okay. Well, I'll pray about that. Thank you.
thank you so
Good,
much.
good. Good morning. So, continuing our look at Messianic prophecy, now that we've looked at the books of Moses and Ruth and 1st and 2nd Samuel, we come to a couple of real treasure troves of Messianic references in the Old Testament. One of them, of course, are the prophets. There's a lot of Messianic prophecy among not just major prophets, but minor prophets. But another one is in the Psalms. Because after God made his messianic promises to David that one of his descendants would be the Messiah and that his descendants would be on the throne forever, it motivated David to write a lot of references to the Messiah in his Psalms, and most of the Psalms, of course, were written by David, not all of them. And so we're going to spend just a couple of weeks on the Psalms, and one of the things that will come out of today, more than anything messianic even, is maybe you'll get a new perspective on the Psalms as a whole. I think it'll be interesting that you might view the Psalms differently than you've ever been taught. The title says the structure of the Psalms. Well, what kind of structure does the book of Psalms have? Because for a lot of people, we've kind of been told it's like a hymn book. It was like the hymn book that they used in the tabernacle worship and the temple worship. And how much structure does a hymn book necessarily have? If you take a look at our hymn book, how is it structured? It's just mostly alphabetical, right? In the case of this particular hymn book, it's alphabetical, except they do a little bit of rearranging to make things fit on pages. But basically it's alphabetical. So what does that mean? If you're looking at song number 52 in our songbook, you don't learn anything about it by saying, well, let me look at the context. Let's look at Song 51 and Song 53, because they're just alphabetically near each other. There's not necessarily any relationship at all. There is no context to speak of. It's just song, song, song. And a lot of people looked at the book of Psalms that way for a long time. It's just a psalm, and then there's another psalm, and then there's another psalm. And that's not necessarily the case. In the last 40 to 50 years, a lot of scholars have examined the book of Psalms and seeing that it actually has a very definite organization. It has a literary structure. It has some continuity from psalm to psalm. And adjacent psalms might inform us about each other, might give us more insight about each other. So, even in your study Bibles, you'll see something that reflects what the Hebrew Bible said. In the Hebrew Bible, at the beginning of the book of Psalms, it says Book 1. And then after a certain number of Psalms, the first 41 Psalms, right before Psalm 42, if you look in, most of your, if you have a real study Bible, not just maybe a pew Bible, right before Psalm 42, it'll say Book 2, Roman numeral 2. And then right before Psalm 73, Book 3, and so on. And so the Hebrews who collected these together, the late prophets, when they were putting the Old Testament together, and they collected together these Psalms, they thought there was some structure. And the Psalms weren't just arranged at random. Different themes appear in these different books. For example, in Book 3, you've got a whole lot of, how long must we wait for your deliverance, Lord? How long do we have to wait for your promises to come true? We're in distress. How much longer do we have to wait for you to rescue us? There's a lot of psalms like that in Book 3. And then you get to Book 4, and there's a dramatic shift in tone. All of a sudden, it's all joy and optimism and praise. Now, this didn't happen by accident. These were arranged this way. And even when you get inside one of the 5 books, scholars are looking at the Hebrew and realizing there's a structure inside Book 1 and there's a structure inside Book 2. Now, Book 1 is what we're concerned with today, and those who've looked at the literary structure have said you've got the first 14 Psalms, and then you've got a group of 10, and then you've got another group of 10, and then you've got a group of 7. Now, the Hebrews attached symbolic meaning to numbers, right? And we see that a lot. We see the same numbers appear in the Bible, right? Like 40 doesn't always mean exactly 40. It means a big number or a long time, especially 40 days and nights, 40 years, The number 7 and numbers that are multiples of 7, like 14 and 70 and so on, were significant to the Hebrews because there were creation days, 7 creation days, and there's a week that's modeled after that, and there's a Sabbath day, and so on. So 7 was kind of a divine number that God has designed something. It has 7 or 14. And then, like most of us, the number 10 is a natural grouping. Got 10 fingers and so on. And so that's just kind of natural. So this is also not any accident. But then when you get inside a group of 10 or a group of 7, there's a structure inside there. And if you really want to understand those Psalms, you really need to see that structure and how they relate to each other. Now, we're interested in that first group of 10 today, which is Psalms 15 through 24, because it's a very Messianic group. And it has a structure that's common to the way Hebrews tended to arrange things. And a lot of times when you look at the Hebrew writings, you'll see a certain structure like A, B, B, A. In other words, the speaker or the writer talks about subject A, and then he talks about subject B. And then he finishes up subject B and comes back to subject A, and so on. Well, there's a little more complicated structure here because we've got 10 psalms. The first psalm is what's called an entrance liturgy, meaning crying out, Lord, Who is allowed to enter your presence? Who is allowed to enter your temple? Who do you allow in your presence? Then there's theme B, which is trust. Then there's theme C, a prayer for help. Then we have a royal psalm about the king. Then we have a creation and law, creation and Torah song. And then we start back down the ladder here. D prime reflects the relationship between D and D prime. We're going back down more royal psalms, the next two. Then we have another prayer for help. You'll notice it's marked C prime because C was a prayer for help. Then we have another song of trust, B prime, because B was song of trust. And of course, this is the famous 23rd Psalm that we're familiar with. Probably the most beautiful song of trust that we can think of. But we don't always think of it as being messianic in any way. But we'll see that there's some structure here. And then we get back to the who can enter your presence psalm. We've come down back now full circle. Now, the old view that scholars used to have a long time ago before they looked into this was, this is a jumble of songs. But you really can't have this kind of structure by accident. And in fact, one of the things that scholars have noticed looking at the Hebrew is that sometimes there will be a certain Hebrew word or phrase that only occurs 2 or 3 or 4 times in the entire Old Testament. And yet, it will occur in B and B prime or C and C prime. So this is not any accident either. It's not a coincidence. There's a grouping together and there's a thematic arrangement here. And we don't have time to dig into the weeds of the Hebrew, but this is what has led the scholars to look at this structure and say there's a relationship here. Well, why does that structure matter to us if we're studying Messianic Psalms? Because a sequence of Psalms can build upon each other. And it's not always easy to see the forest when you're looking at just one tree. You can get into one particular psalm, and there's just a little hint of the Messianic hope, the Messianic expectation. If you take that psalm by itself, you could say, well, I don't know, maybe that sentence in the middle of the psalm had something to do with the Messiah, or maybe it didn't, I don't know. When you see 7 or 10 psalms together and you see them flowing and using the same language as each other, another psalm in that group could be more obvious, but it could use this particular Hebrew phrase. And so you connect the psalms together. You can say, here's a psalm that's obviously messianic. Here's one that I'm not sure, but they're using some of these same key phrases in Hebrew that are very rare in the Bible. So then you start understanding that this is about the Messiah. We want to look today at Psalm 16, which we've identified, many scholars have identified as a psalm that predicts the resurrection of the Messiah. Now, remember, the group of 10 started with Psalm 15. And Psalm 15 is a who can enter your presence, Lord, psalm. And it answers it by saying there's an ideal king who's presented in that psalm. That's who can enter the presence of the Lord, is the ideal king. Now, Psalm 15 by itself isn't obviously messianic. Who's the ideal king? Doesn't have to be the Messiah all by itself, but there are many places in David's writings and speaking where he emphasizes he is not the ideal king. David was humbled by his own sin, particularly with Bathsheba. David writes with great anguish about his imperfection. David recognizes he's not the ideal king. In the Psalms and in some of the languages he uses in 2 Samuel. And so, by itself, Psalm 15 might or might not be a messianic psalm. But when you put together all the context of the Psalms, it's talking about an ideal king, and David says over and over, not me. I'm not the ideal king. I have fallen far short of that. Well, then who is it? Now, to outline Psalm 16, the first verse is the king, which would have to be connected to the ideal king that we just read about in the previous psalm. See, when we stop taking psalms one at a time like they have no context, we just talked about how the ideal king is the one who can enter the Lord's presence. And then we start talking right off the bat in Psalm 16 that the king requests his preservation by God. And then we have half a dozen verses in which this king talks about how in his earthly life he's confident that the Lord will bless him and take care of him. And then we finish with 4 verses that say the king is confident of the Lord's presence even after he dies, even when he's in the grave. And that's the section that's going to get really interesting here. The salvation from the grave. So what's going on? Is this just David saying, I'm confident that the Lord will protect me from dying, from my enemies killing me? Because that is a theme in some psalms. Is that all that's going on? Or is David saying, I'm confident that even though I will die like everybody else, that there will be a resurrection someday, the general resurrection of all the believers, and I'll be one of them. Or the third possibility, is he talking about the Messiah's resurrection? Well, we've already seen that in context, this is about the ideal king. And the ideal king is not David. Okay? So if it's not the Messiah, who is it? Now, the New Testament authors had a very definite interpretation that was messianic. And there's a lot of evidence that they weren't taking off on some brand new tangent in the first century. This is how the Jews interpreted it. The Jews interpreted Psalm 16 as messianic until the point in time when the Christians came along and started interpreting it that way also. And now they had an incentive to say, the Christians are saying that Jesus was the Messiah. The Christians are saying Jesus was resurrected. The Christians are saying Psalm 16 predicted his resurrection. So now they've got an incentive to say, well, actually, no, it's not about the resurrection of the Messiah. But until the Christians came along, this was a common interpretation. And so the New Testament interpretation by Peter and Paul simply reflects the first century Jewish attitude, which this was about the Messiah being resurrected. The first sermons to the Jews, the first sermon of Peter to the Jews was, of course, when? So on one of those feasts that Tim just talked about here. Pentecost, right? Well, Peter's going to make a reference right back to Psalm 16 as part of his way of convincing the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. And in the famous sermon in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, starting in verse 22, here's what Peter preached. Men of Israel, listen to these words. This Jesus, the Nazarene, was a man pointed out to you by God with miracles, wonders, and signs that God did among you through him, just as you yourselves know. Though he was delivered up according to God's determined plan and foreknowledge, you used lawless people to nail him to a cross and kill him. God raised him up, ending the pains of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by death. For David says of him, and now Peter's going to quote from the Psalms, I saw the Lord ever before me, because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad and my tongue rejoiced. Moreover, my flesh will rest in hope, because you will not leave my soul in Hades. That's Sheol from Hebrew being translated to Greek by Peter. Hades, the grave, the place where you go when you die. You will not leave my soul in Hades or allow your Holy One to see decay. You have revealed the paths of life to me. You will fill me with gladness in your presence. And that's the end of Psalm 16. Returning to Peter now, Peter continues, brothers, I can confidently speak to you about the patriarch David. He is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. In other words, if David was saying, God won't let my body decay in the grave, well, he was a false prophet, because David died and was buried like anybody else. His tomb's with us to this day. Since he was a prophet, he knew that God had sworn an oath to him to seat one of his descendants on his throne. Seeing this in advance, he spoke concerning the resurrection of the Messiah. He was not left in Hades, and his flesh did not experience decay. God has resurrected this Jesus. We are all witnesses of this. So Peter's interpretation is obvious here. This is about the Messiah who won't see decay. What about Paul? The first time that Paul preaches to Jews, he uses Messianic Psalms in his preaching. We see this in Acts chapter 13. As we're transitioning from the kind of the Peter and Philip and so on section of Acts to the Paul section, the first thing that happens is that Paul gives a public sermon, quite lengthy. We'll just take a look at a few of the verses, starting in verse 32. Paul says, and we ourselves proclaim to you the good news of the promise that was made to our forefathers. God has fulfilled this to us, their children, by raising up Jesus. As it is written in the second psalm, and now he goes back and he quotes one of those little snippets that maybe at the time you wouldn't catch that it was messianic, but when you think about it, you are my son, today I have become your father. So who is God saying is his son? Is it just David, or is it someone higher and more perfect than David? Since he raised him from the dead, never to return to decay, he has spoken in this way, I will grant you the faithful covenant blessings made to David. Therefore, he also says in another passage, you will not allow your Holy One to see decay, quoting from Psalm 16, verse 10. For David, after serving his own generation in God's plan, fell asleep and was buried with his fathers and decayed. But the one whom God raised up did not decay. So Paul is obviously giving the exact same interpretation here as Peter did. Now, there's one translation issue that unfortunately arises. Most of the translations of Psalm 16, verse 10 say, "You will not allow your Holy One to see decay or corruption." The Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, the King James, New King James, American Standard, New American Standard, the NIV, the English Standard Version, all say that. But there are a few translations where it says, "You will not allow your Holy One to see the pit," which would mean the grave. The Jerusalem Publication Society, which is a Jewish translation of the Old Testament, the Revised and New Revised Standard and the New English Translation are examples. Now, if you just say you won't allow your Holy One to see the pit, that changes everything, because that could just be a statement that you're not going to let David die. Now, obviously David died eventually, but it would be a statement that you're going to protect David from a premature death at the hands of his enemies or something like that. Now, there's lots and lots of arguments. You could go on for an hour about the arguments about how to translate it, but there's a lot of reasons why most translations have decay or corruption, including translations like the Septuagint was a translation made by Jews of the Old Testament into Greek a couple of centuries before Christ, and Samaritan translations and so on. Everyone believed in translating it corruption or decay until the Christians came along, and then the Jews translated it differently. But I'll just take one example argument because we don't have time for all of them. A scholar of Hebrew grammar notes that when the word see is used, it's 90-something% of the time it just means you see something with your eyeballs. But when it's used figuratively, it means, when you see good times or you see bad times, that means you experience them. So when see is used figuratively, it means you experience something. You experience a certain state, a state of blessedness or punishment or whatever. However, it's never associated with a place. Decay or corruption is a state that you can experience. A pit is a place. The natural construction in Hebrew would be descend into the grave, descend into the pit, not see it, not experience it. And so you can see other examples. If you search through the Hebrew Old Testament on this word that's translated see, like I said, you'll go on and on and on where it's just literally see something with your eyeballs. But when you see it figuratively, it's experience something. Not descend. You would descend into the pit. So that brings us to the question, who is going to avoid decay? Well, Peter and Paul would say, sure wasn't David, right? It has to be the Messiah. And here's where it becomes important to see this whole connection of this group of 10 Psalms. This whole section is about that ideal king of Psalm 15, and David is not the ideal king according to his own words. The king, this ideal king, is referred to as the anointed, which is Hebrew Mashiach, the Messiah. But in the key phrase to me in this verse, verse 10, you will not allow your Holy One to see corruption. It wouldn't be very modest of David to refer to himself as God's Holy One, especially given the humble way that he describes himself so many times as being not the ideal king. But your Holy One would fit perfectly with the Messiah. Now, next week we'll take a look at Psalm 22, which talks explicitly about the death of the king. Which king? The ideal king? Any king? That's what we'll look at next time. But you'll recognize Psalm 22, which begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is what Jesus said upon the cross. So I think we have a pretty good idea that Jesus interpreted it messianically. Psalm 22 talks about the king dying, but it ends with the king's deliverance. And chronologically in the psalm, the deliverance happens after death. So we'll look next time at Psalm 22, in which the king dies and yet is delivered. So thank you much for your attention.